So earlier in the year, I was able to pick up the Princess Auto Square Camp wood stove with pipes, and I was able to actually take this wood stove hot tent camping with me recently. Now, the stove itself, while being unbranded on the Princess Auto website, is actually sold as a Red Mountain Valley small square wood stove, and this is what the box says once you get into Princess Auto and pick it up. It comes with 5 interlocking stove pipes, an ash rake, and a poker, and it typically retails for $199 Canadian, and it'll often go on sale for between $100 and $150. It's not light, it comes in at 41.4 pounds with all the stove pipes inside, so the entire container. And if you take out the stove pipe, it weighs about 30 pounds. The firebox is just over 21 inches or 53 centimeters deep. It's 13 inches or 33 centimeters wide, 10 inches or 25 centimeters tall. So it's a good sized firebox for what it is. And the stove stands approximately 1 foot tall between the ground and the bottom of the firebox. That's 30 centimeters. The stove will easily accommodate most standard quarter pieces that are 16 inches long, and with a good burning hardwood or softwood, you can easily put half a face cord into the stove before you have to clean out the ash. While it's a good stove for the price, in my previous review there were many problems that came to light almost immediately upon use. First off, the factory paint is terrible. It basically burnt off during the curing process and it just started bubbling and peeling away. So I sandblasted and wire brushed the entire body of the stove back to bare metal, and then I used high temperature Imperial stove paint to repaint everything. The Imperial brand is great because it's intended for wood stoves. It has a nice flat black matte finish. It goes on easily and uniformly. It dries quickly and it cures really quickly as well. So once you heat the stove up, and more importantly, it's designed to withstand temperatures of 700 degrees Celsius or 1300 degrees Fahrenheit, which are actually attainable with this particular stove. The second issue with the stove was the gasket or the thermotape, which essentially is a fiberglass fabric that's used to create a seal between the body of the stove and the door when it's closed. I'm not sure what thermotape the manufacturer used, but the adhesive melted off almost immediately. I never did reapply it because I found the door actually closed better without it. But if you do want to put on some sort of a thermotape, I'd recommend the Imperial Fireplace Thermotape Kit, since again, just like the paint, it'll work and it won't melt off. The third issue with the stove is the chimney or stovepipe. The pipe itself is very robust and each section is pretty heavy, so you have to be careful not to let it fall or hit you because that'll hurt. The stove comes with 5 sections of pipe, including a spark arrestor. The stovepipe itself is okay. The problem is that the sections loosely fit together, so there's give or sway, and as you add more sections, this effect is amplified. Even if the first section of pipe is perfectly leveled, once you get to the last section where the spark arrestor is, there will be a tilt in some direction. The only way to really prevent this tilt is to securely guide the top of the stovepipe using the holes in the spark arrestor and then making sure everything is fairly taut. Now, instead of using this pipe, I picked up 3.5-inch Winterwell branded stainless steel stovepipe, which is fantastic. The Winterwell pipe is very light and each section fits together snugly, and there's virtually no give or sway, so the pipe will go in whatever direction you want easily. The only drawback to consider is that it's not cheap, with each section coming in around $25 Canadian on Amazon. That said, the pipe will last forever, and you can also get 45-degree angle pieces, allowing you to bend the stovepipe in different directions with the angled sections. The one caveat with the Winterwell pipe is that it only loosely fits the collar that connects the stovepipe to the body of the stove or the firebox. However, the pipe that came with the stove is actually 3.45 inches in diameter as opposed to a true 3.5 inches. So what I did is I left one section of the original stovepipe connected to the collar, and I drilled and tapped a 1/4-20 hole through both the collar and pipe. After this, I inserted the matching machine bolt which firmly locked both pieces together. After that, I was able to push a piece of the Winterwell pipe down on top of the original stovepipe towards the bottom where the actual original stovepipe bulges out. This section formed a secure seal and locked the Winterwell pipe in place. After that, I was able to attach additional sections of the Winterwell pipe and build the chimney out. The benefit to this is also that stainless steel is not magnetic, but by having the original pipe hidden inside the Winterwell pipe, which is magnetic, I'm still able to use a stovepipe temperature gauge that magnetically adheres. Now, as far as using a spark arrestor with the Winterwell pipe, I don't actually use one. Instead, what I do is I use a 45-degree section of Winterwell pipe to bend it through the stove jack in the Tipi, And I just have additional sections, about 5 sections on the end of the pipe. And what this does is this angles the pipe away from the teepee. So I just make sure wherever I'm set up that this pipe is always facing downwind. Now, you tend to get the most sparks during an overfire situation with any stove. The interesting thing with an overfire situation is that's also when you have the most drafting and velocity within the actual stovepipe. So, by simply angling the stovepipe up and away from the teepee or the hot tent at a 45-degree angle, all the sparks are being ejected downwind. With a standard vertical stovepipe and spark arrestor on top, if it's a windless day, you run the risk that the spark arrestor will actually slow down the sparks and they could potentially fall back to your hot tent and start burning holes in it. Whereas if the piping is at a 45-degree angle and there's no spark arrestor, there's nothing to slow down those sparks, so they'll just keep going out and away from your tent even on a windless day. All in all, once I repainted the stove and I modified the chimney pipe and used the winter well pipe instead, this is actually a great stove. It's not the lightest stove, but it does put off a lot of heat. One consideration is that the firebox isn't necessarily always square. And what I mean by that is if you're using it to cook on, you have to be aware that there is a little bit of warping that occurs when it's under heat. So what this means is that if you're cooking on the top of the wood stove, it's not going to be perfectly flat. So if you have a pot over there, some part of the pot might slightly rise above the surface of the stove, which isn't a big deal. It'll just slow down cooking ever so slightly. But having a square wood stove is far better than having a round one because of the amount of surface area that's still actually in contact with the hot metal on the wood stove, as opposed to having heat transferred to the pot through the air, which is mostly what happens with one of the round style stoves. And like I mentioned in my previous videos, the poker and ash rake that come with the stove are perfectly fine and they work well. One thing to remember with this stove is that some of the hex bolts need to be tightened periodically to keep everything firm. I haven't had a problem with anything falling off or falling out, but I do check them routinely. For the price all in all and with the modifications, this really is a great stove. It would be nice if it had a window, but nonetheless, it drafts really well, it's easy to control, and functionally it does what it's supposed to do. What's also impressive is the amount of wood you can put through it. Like I mentioned earlier, you can put in half of a face cord of wood before you need to actually consider cleaning it out. And that concludes the review for the Princess Auto Square Wood Stove. There was one last thing. If you're wondering how I supported the end of the stove pipe coming out of the teepee, I actually used a hex connector that's a 1/4-20, and I screwed that into the end of a camera light stand, which goes way up in the air. And that was it. I just welded it on to a 4-inch muffler clamp. I took off the actual U part of the clamp, and away we went. It was perfect. So, hope you enjoyed the review. Maybe I'll have another one in the near future.